Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of Thoughts Unraveled. As we previously mentioned, the purpose and format of this podcast is intentionally back to basics. We want to keep things conversational and with minimal editing, so you'll get our real unpolished thoughts on the topics that we cover. As always, our conversation may wander down different paths, and in the first two episodes, that's certainly been the case. So even we don't know where that will go in this episode as well. If you're enjoying this episode, then please do subscribe to the podcast at thoughtsunraveled.substack.com. Without further ado, let's get going. So, Hugo, why don't you quickly introduce yourself again?
Yeah. Hi, folks. This is Hugo Freusch. I'm the head of product operations at OLX, and happy to be here as always. And I'll pass back to Chris.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Hugo. So I'm Chris. I'm a founder and independent product ops consultant. I've also recently just launched Product Ops Leaders, which is a community for senior leaders in the product ops space. And if that sounds like you, then you can join our community of experienced leaders where you can learn together through regular small cohort live conversations. We've already had a bunch of people sign up over just the first couple of days of announcing this. So please go ahead and register at productopsleaders.com, and we'd love to have you on board for those conversations. Okay, so today's topic is all about being practical, being objective, being pragmatic. Essentially, the role of product operations when you just have to get shit done. This is an ongoing conversation in the community and with many people I speak with, and our understanding of what the strategic level work looks like versus the tactical level work, how you have a balance between those things, maybe even how a team of one has to be pragmatic in choosing which direction to go in to show value and impact early. And how to grow a team with objective and practical mindsets is something that product operations leaders often talk about in their groups. So Hugo, what are your initial thoughts on this, on the getting shit done part?
Yeah, I actually love this topic, and obviously we've gone back and forth on this topic over the years, right? Because I think we're in that unique role, right? Where, for example, we're sitting in a meeting, we're sitting in, the middle of a project we've been working on for 3 months, and then we have this thing where we step back and we see the big picture. And you look and you realize, oh my goodness, I've just spent months ridiculously wasting time, right? I've done the wrong thing. We are so wrong in what we're doing. Or something has become so overly complicated and we've lost track of what was the initial thing we wanted to do, right? And you look and it's like, how do we flip change, right? How do we slip around that? And the problem is, and we've seen this, right? When people overinvest, they almost don't want to go back to the drawing board, or they want to admit that it's wrong and start over again, right? And I mean, you remember, and you obviously have great examples during the design flow work at Farfetch, right? We went through iterations based on the feedback we were getting, and at any time we would rethink these things again, right? And this is just like the top of the cake, right? At the end of the day, it's about looking and sometimes just doing it, right? And I remember we were in one call one time and we were listening to, someone describing how they had been working on something for the last month or so, and they were going to present and they were going to thinking about doing this in huge A/B test and everything. And you asked a simple question, right? You turn around and said, okay, how many users is this impacting? And they said, oh, well, it's impacting at, 10% of our users or 7% of our users use this feature. You're like, okay, great. And they said, and of those 7%, 5% are unable to complete this task because of this. And you turn around to the person and I said, I'm sorry, just launch this stuff. Stop talking about testing it. Just launch it. You're not going to break anything. It's too small a user base. You've already spent way too much time on it, right? And I love this example. You look at it and you think, oh my goodness, it's true. They've spent way too much time on it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when I think about the work that product ops practitioners do, I kind of fall back on what should be, and often isn't the case, but what should be a very classic product management, product design, product development approach, which is, I don't know if we're even allowed to use the word MVP, the phrase MVP anymore. Is anyone really doing that? I'm not sure if it still stands. But we should be taking that approach, right? Where we're iterative. Let's just call it an iterative approach. We're experimental, but we're experimental for learning purposes. So your example doesn't quite fit into that because those people are not going to learn that much from A/B testing it. They're probably going to learn a lot from launching something relatively small and quick. And I think it all comes back down to just evidence-based decision making, and Product Top should take that approach as well. So, okay, we're not putting things in the hands of end customers like a product team might be, but we should still have an experimental approach to introducing change to the organization. Not on everything, not on absolutely everything. Some stuff is quite apparent that we just need to make the change happen. But the rest of the bigger changes, we can be iterative.
But even the stuff that we just need to make happen, right? I've become a fan of not over investing for too long, right? And like you said, it's the whole concept of, we're telling product teams how they should function, how they should experiment. We're giving them a whole bunch of tools, a whole bunch of frameworks. We're kind of providing this, guidelines, helping them through these processes for them to get better at this. And then very often I see it where we don't adopt that way of working ourselves, right? We don't practice what we preach. And you look and you'll say, like, a product ops person might go away and they come back and after 6 months and they've got this incredible, well-designed infrastructure, everything end to end, every single point has been
Which
thought
takes
of.
another 6 months to introduce, right?
Exactly. And the problem is, you implement it and then it breaks. Right? It suddenly someone comes up and says, "Oh, but what about in these cases? Oh, I have to go back to the drawing board." And you just spent those 6 months, and it's a waste of time, right? And I think it goes back to in our design days. I always like to think about that concept of the wireframing, right? And I know there's a debate right now, apparently, about wireframing, right? I don't know if you saw it because I think who was it? It was uh, Duolingo said they don't do wireframes. Okay, it's stipulated they don't do wireframes. Not talking about the people they just let go because of AI, right? But they don't do wireframes. And it's the same thing I use, right? Which is the amount of time you invest in something, the harder it is to make the changes, right? So, and I remember when we started out in design, you used to do these high fidelity prototypes and put it in front of people. And then people would turn around and say, "Oh, I want you to change this. I don't like that, or I'm not feeling." And you're like, "Oh." So you would argue to not have to change it, right? We would argue not to change our designs. The wireframes helped in that sense, which is let me just throw something quick and dirty in front of someone to validate whether I'm in the right direction, right? And here it's the same thing. It's like just put it in front of people to realize if it's worth the investment of spending the next 6 months on it, right? Sorry, go ahead, go ahead.
No, no, absolutely. It's interesting you say that because I 100% agree that a quick sketch somewhere to say, do we think this is the right direction to go in is super valuable. And I think we should approach things in that way. And that's how I do it. I find it quite interesting though. And we've definitely both been through these scenarios, and I hear it from other people where you actually don't get the right type of feedback until the very last moment of something going live. And I mean from a more an internal perspective, like not an end customer perspective, because we can learn from them at different stages. But if you're working with internal customers, internal users, internal partners and stakeholders, collaborators, it's still quite surprising to me, I suppose, when you're showing wireframes and it's like, yeah, this seems to be the right direction. And then you get to the end part where, okay, we've actually built something, we're going to be showing something. It actually works now. It's mostly in place. And then all the real feedback comes in, and you end up having to change quite a lot at that stage.
Yeah, that's why I like, and I agree with you, that does happen because people don't seem to pay attention
Mm.
until the real thing. But even when they give that feedback, I found that very often, and I don't know if you've seen the same thing, the feedback that they're giving is assuming it was built for another purpose, right? They're suddenly assuming that it's supposed to be doing something completely different or going in a completely different direction. You're like, folks, what we wanted to solve was X, right? You're now talking about Y. Obviously, it's going to be the wrong thing, right? But what I like as a concept, and I heard this one from Melissa in a talk a couple of years ago, the first time I heard Melissa talking live, and she spoke about the minimum viable experiment, right? And that's how I like to approach it, and also taking that lean approach, which is How do I put something in people's hands? And like you were saying, the wireframe doesn't always have to be a quick sketch on a piece of paper, right? It can be where you put, for example, you just configure the simple version of something and put it in front of people and they start using it. It's part of their process. And they'll come back and they'll say, oh, this is great, but it's kind of simple. It doesn't do this, this, and that. And you're like, okay, great. We can add that, right? Let's test that out. And you test quick and dirty, these little iterations of these. So in the beginning, the value might not be clear, but people already see the potential and then you start adding that value, right? And that's how I kind of like to approach it, but it's not easy in every situation, right? Because most people will say, yeah, you just wasted your time. You're like, no, I'm validating, right? If it makes sense.
So I guess a question to you then is, how do you think about making the right decision on what fidelity of, let's just call it a new process that you're introducing or a change to a process that already exists? I know we're kind of, I'm using a basic example here because obviously Product Ops isn't just about introducing or removing processes, but let's just use that for now as an example. Like, how do you prioritize and balance out the the need to spend sometimes quite a bit of time to understand all the nuances, the moving parts, the people involved, the tools and systems that back everything up, the introduction of new phrases, terminology across the organization, but a new process that has to be embedded versus actually we do just need to get stuff done. We have to show progress. We can't spend, and I in my head, I have an example as well where a team I was working with, someone spent probably up to 6 months trying to define every single moving piece of a process. And leadership were getting quite frustrated that progress wasn't being made, that something wasn't happening. So how do you balance those things out and decide, okay, with this, we can move a little quicker. Maybe we do, what do they used to call those experiments? Was it like Wizard of Oz experiment where it looks like it's a working tool, but or a concierge experiment, was it? But in the background, it's basically just a spreadsheet and a lot of people trying to move manual data around. Like, how do you balance those things?
I think this, and it goes back to the whole thing about being practical, right? What we always forget is number one, what is the question we're trying to answer, right? And what is the purpose of what we're trying to solve, right? What are we trying to solve? And most people will go off on these things in this big, like if you're looking at a tool, right? And I want to solve this. And then they say, oh, but the tool can also do this. And people get excited about those things. And then it suddenly becomes this huge thing, right? And you're like, hold on, let's go back. Did it solve the baseline problem I was looking for? So I think we have to keep that always in mind. That's one thing. But like you said, sometimes it has to be the concierge thing where you just kind of put it together, right? But for example, it has happened to me where I'm in a call, right? And people are talking for an hour, 2 hours, and you realize in 5 minutes I can just build this, all right? Or I can just create it. And you're in the background, you create it, and you come back to them and say, "Is this what we're talking about?" And I did this. I remember there was one time, and I used the story mapping topic, right? User story mapping, and I was in this meeting, and they were debating the designer, the engineers. They were back and forth, and it was going for half an hour. And then I sat down and I started writing on post-its and started putting it on the board, right? Just laying this out. And then I turned around to them and I said, okay, folks, can I interrupt you for a second? And I told them to look at the board and I said, is this what we're talking about? And they said, oh, actually, yes. And in that second, right, you just realize it can be done. And the same thing you're saying is, for example, people are talking about, can we get this data? Can we get this information? And you turn around and said, I spend a day around an Excel spreadsheet and I can get that data analyzed. And I'm not a data analyst, right? But we can get some of that data and give us at least the baseline of it. So sometimes, like you said, it's just doing it. You don't even have to worry about the fidelity. Just do it because talking about it will spend more time than actually just doing it, right? And so it's about finding that balance. Like and I'd love to hear your example as well because I'm curious because it is about finding that balance, right? There's no one way is the only way.
Yeah, I mean, I think my example was a process for a SaaS enterprise product, B2B SaaS enterprise product. They wanted to gather, and I think I've used this example multiple times now for different reasons, actually, but they wanted to gather opportunities from around the organization and bring those opportunities into the product team so they can use them as part of their planning. And they already had a process that existed, but it wasn't particularly stable. It was done in different countries in different ways. And the link between each of those countries and getting back to the product team was very sporadic. And really, none of those opportunities saw the light of day, even if they were valuable ones, they never really came through. So essentially, I introduced us a more stable way of doing it. I didn't do anything particularly innovative. It was still just a Google form with a spreadsheet at the end, but we just made sure that everyone was using the same one, the same language, the same terminology, time frame, and we made sure that all of those opportunities had a deadline per quarter, and then they just fed into the product teams. And creating a Google form like that, the actual creation of it is about 15 minutes, understanding what questions to ask, sorting a timeline out, and doing all the other bits and pieces. Probably took around a week. Let's just say it took a week to get all that in place. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. Was it way better than what existed? Absolutely. And those opportunities were coming through, and the teams are working on them, and they're producing value for customers, which is fantastic. There's other parts of that process that then needed to be worked on, and it was great that we'd made a couple of steps forward because the noise all calmed down around us. We can say to people, we're making progress. Yes, there's things to do, but use this for the next quarter. In the background, we were then able to do a lot more work, research, interviews with the relevant stakeholders and partners, and then start to bolster this new opportunities process with further structure. And at the same time, be iterative because we're taking in that information. Versus a similar change that we had to make where one of the team went away and did all the research up front. And I'm not saying that was bad. Of course, we should do a certain level of research, but it was taking so long to progress anything that by the time the process had been defined, all the communication points, all the timeline, things had moved on so much that it was less relevant. So it wasn't wasted time because we could still use what was there, but it was way less relevant now than other changes that were happening in the organization we had to shift our focus to. It's interesting listening to your story as well, because something, and a part of this topic was around objective and subjective thinking. Now, what you kind of described from what I heard was that while you were listening to this conversation, you were able to take quite an objective approach, cut out some of that subjective thought and noise and go, is this what it is? Is this what we're talking about? Not that I care about this thing or I think this is the best. It's just, is this what this might be? And how do we progress from there? So I'd be interested to hear from you what you think the value of having an objective mind versus a subjective mind in the role of a product operations leader. Like how valuable is that, do you think? Where do you see it coming to the fore in your day to day?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a good question. I have to say it's probably a balance of things, right? Because sometimes we have to have the subjectivity in the sense of we have to have an open mind, right? So we almost have to be like that, an empty recipient, ready to get other people telling us how they think about it, because we have to, a lot of the changes we have to do have to adapt to the way people work, right? And how people fix and their context and how they live their day to day. There we have to have subjectivity because we have to understand their reality. And there I think the background, having done user research and that kind of stuff helps a lot because you're an active listener. You're letting them decide, you're letting them tell you what it should be, what it shouldn't be, and all that kind of stuff, right? But then you do have to cut through all the mess, right? You have to cut through all the confusion. And, I was taking a note here because as you were talking earlier, I was thinking about some sessions where, you go into these big sessions and they said, oh, we're going to do this ideation. And I remember before it used to be called brainstorming, right? And they put 20 people, 30 people in a room, and the people are talking there for 2 days. It's incredible. They come out of it and they say, oh, I feel energized. I feel excited. And you say, okay, great. What are you going to do next? And they say, I have no idea. Right. And you're like, okay, we've just wasted 2 days, right? And I think sometimes it is that, right? And it's like I was mentioning earlier, it's around that thing around being able to step away and look at it in a way and say, what is it? What isn't it? Right? How do I make it simple? And don't get me wrong, and I was actually explaining my thought process recently to someone, and I was saying, I've got projects that I'm working on, and I'll be working on it for 2 weeks. right? And I've got a deadline. Let's say I've got a deadline for the Friday of the second week, and I'm working on it, and I'll reach, Wednesday, Thursday, and I've gone through so many iterations. I'm super happy. I'm almost at the finish line, and then I'll look and I'll say, I've done this wrong. I've taken the wrong approach. And over the next 24 hours, I will redo everything from scratch sometimes, right? But what comes out of it is so much, 1,000 times better than anything I was building over the last 2 weeks because it has made that click. So it's not something I feel can happen automatically all the time, but sometimes, and then again, maybe the subjectivity comes into it as well, right? It's a mix of the two, which is you also have to be open to these other options coming into your mind, right? And then suddenly you go, oh, wait, let me rethink this. And for example, a slide deck that was something of, 10 to 15 slides suddenly becomes five, but it hits the message home, right? And here I'm simplifying, but there's projects that it's exactly the same thing. Um,
Yeah, it's I it's really hard, I think, for humans to not be subjective. Of course, that's the very nature of subjectivity. We have our own thoughts and feelings about things, and we want to share them and express them, and we have our own opinion. Sometimes that ends up potentially being political, and we see that in organizations too, where people kind of push their reality a little bit more than others. I think it's actually very challenging to be truly objective. Firstly, with the things that you're involved in and care about and creating, and secondly, with the things that other people are also creating, because you're in that space, you have a subjective viewpoint. I think it's upon product operations to try and diffuse some of that somewhat, not like fully, because I still think a subjective view is important. Again, we hire, people that are intelligent, capable, experienced, and they should have good, strong opinions, but they should also be. I think we as a group should also be open to a more objective reality if it's shared with us. So, what data do we have that backs up your decision? Okay, well, you don't have any data. That's great. Well, now we need to go away and think about that. I remember years ago, like honestly, 10 years ago now, I joined a client out in Dublin. And again, we're using, actually, interestingly, using quite a lot of design related stories today on this podcast. And I joined to help a product development team and product design team, and was working with their head of design. And they used to do design critiques or feature critiques, product critiques, and they were so subjective, bordering on, yeah, I don't like this. Have you tried X? Now, when a leader in the room says that, the person that's presenting that work, they're painted into a corner and they can only say, no, I'll go and try X and see how that works. Rather than opening up the question, this is an interesting decision that you've made. What data do you have from new users that backs up this decision? Or do you need to go and test it and learn something? Opens up the conversation more objectively. Um, I find it very interesting in product operations because a lot of the time when you're looking into what changes you could introduce, changes being things you add, things you remove, even just monitoring situations or getting other people involved. A lot of the time, I think you find, maybe this is a broad statement, but like product managers very, very quickly and subjectively questioning what the change is, why it's happening, why it should be happening like that. And a lot of the time, I think product managers are very focused on their product area and their teams, or at least the companies I've worked with. And therefore, like, other teams are less interesting to them, other product areas are less interesting. So they have their own subjective view of how things should work. And I think that can often be a challenge for product operations to come in and maintain objectivity and try and help those teams to understand the broader impact, not just on their teams themselves. And I think that's a big challenge. I was wondering if you'd come across that as well.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. And it's actually connected to something I was going to ask you, right? Which is, there's the design by committee, there's, these co-design things you can use, but also there's times where you kind of know the direction it has to go. right? And it's like you're going to get, like you were saying, right? You're going to get people saying, "Oh, but I don't agree with it." And you're going to get pushback, or they want to do co-design and they want to do this design by committee and everything. And it's like that's a waste of time because you know what the solution is going to be, right? And what should be. You're pretty sure your experience has taught you what it should be. Um, and yeah, I'm just wondering how you think about that, right? Because it fits in a bit with this. I don't have, look, I've got opinions, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Subjective opinions, Hugo.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, we used to call it the benevolent dictator, right? And it gets to a level where, and this is, we learned a lot of this at Farfetch, working together, working with Kuldeep, Bruno, Justin. We learned a lot about this. Um, Co-creation, I think design by committee sounds really negative. I don't know if that's just the connotations I have in my mind, that it sounds like maybe it's become a bit of a joke. But co-creation is important, and I think particularly with impactful change that's quite broad and can be quite impactful, meaning impactful negatively as well as positively, you need to get people involved in that co-creation. Now, to what level you get them involved will be dependent on what the change looks like, what seniority level they are, whether you need sponsorship for someone more senior or you need someone like on the ground in the detail to give you the information to provide support and help in some of the moving parts. Co-creation is going to be like key to the success of it. However, having said that, there are times, and I use that product opportunity intake process as an example. I'd done that in multiple organizations previously. I knew the steps we had to go through. Now, even though every organization is, idiosyncratic in a way that they make the way they operate and the decisions they make, the people they have is very specific to their organization. There's some things like an opportunity intake process that can be quite standard. And again, I go back to the example that I was using. That first iteration, that first thing we did was using the standard model. These are the steps we must go through. The second iteration, we actually modified some of it. We changed step one and step two around a little bit because of the way that that organization was doing its planning, because of the setup and the experience of certain teams and certain members. Like we changed things around. And I think that's absolutely fine. But essentially, we knew at the beginning that we just had to start with something. You can also use the benevolent dictator concept in a way that if you've been through a lot of that co-creation, you're introducing the change and it's taking some time. There's some blockers in the way. There's some accidental sabotage happening or unconscious sabotage happening. There are times where you might just have to go to the most senior person in the room and say, you are going to have to help force this through. What did we call that at Farfetch? I think we called it sock puppeting. But it's also called air cover as well. Like you need air cover from senior leaders, but you also need those leaders to speak your words because they just have a higher level of authority to kind of push things through. On this point, just before I kind of pass back, in fact, I have another question before I pass back to you. But on this point, the Lippitt model for change is a really interesting and important one to follow because it will give you some focus areas to ensure that change has a higher chance of success. I just mentioned accidental sabotage or unconscious sabotage there, where there may be people that are just not fully bought into the ideas you're introducing, maybe from a political angle, maybe because it doesn't impact them too much, maybe because they just fully disagree. But that essentially sabotages the change you're trying to introduce. And there's a number of other things that can, derail change that's important to look at. Unless you have a follow-up point, do have another question.
No, I do have a follow-up point, right? Which is, and it goes to your point, right? What I've done is, and I remember the time when I was doing consulting work. So we were a SWAT team in public, in the public space, and there was two ways we approached it, right? And the way I thought about it was, do we want the conversation to be open? Or did we want to direct the conversation of co-design? So if we wanted it to be open, we would go with, a very open agenda. It would be around the subjective discussion. It would be about opening up and discussing. There would be times, like you said, where I knew that we would spend, an entire meeting, come out of it and have no conclusion, right? And I wanted to go to a conclusion. So what I would do would, you think about the constraints, right? How do you set the constraints so that the conversation is focused? Maybe it's about doing or building at least the baseline to start the conversation, because, it's the type of thing where you turn around to a person and say, oh, what kind of app would be great for you to, schedule your meetings? It could be 100 different things, and you could have a brainstorming that could go for hours and stuff like that, right? Days, and you don't reach any concrete conclusion. Whereas if you turn around and you say, hey, I've built a baseline. Here's a draft of a way of thinking of how we could schedule, an app that could schedule this. Now, let's discuss it. And you build on that, right? And so that what happens is you basically build the layers that they see are important there that you didn't consider, that you didn't think, but it gives a bit more focus, right? And sometimes it's about deciding between those two balances, and that's how I like to approach it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same concept as, or similar concept as like forcing functions, isn't it? We get to a stage where we now have to make a decision. What are those gates that we must go through? I mean, gates, again, it sounds really negative, but more forcing functions, like we're forced into making a decision at this point. We've spent enough time discussing. Now, this is the type of decision we need to make. These are the people we need in the room. This is how we're going to then move forward. Just a slight kind of change of direction. I think it's worth touching upon the strategic work of a product operations function versus the tactical work of a product operations function, the balance between those two things. Particularly when joining, maybe particularly for product ops practitioners who are a team of one, or newly joining leaders of product operations where they have to build a team. So they start off as a team of one, then have to grow a team. I think we've both experienced in different ways or experienced through other people the challenges of keeping the product operations work strategic when, again, we push back on saying we need to make progress happen, we need to get shit done, things have to happen. And like keeping out of that like death spiral almost of once you start doing the tactical work, that's the work that's going to be expected of you. Doing smaller iterative change, and that you end up in a dangerous position there, where product operations is seen as the administration of the organization, the support function only, and not a function that's enabling the rest of the organization. It's simply just for support. And in times of financial constraints, it can be quite a dangerous place to be if you're seen only at that level. At the same time, and I remember speaking, I think we were talking with Kara about this, right? Like if you only do the strategic work, there's a lot of tactical things that have to happen that don't get done. And again, you're not seen as having enough impact. So again, where do you see that balance in your team at OLX and the way that you structure it? Where do you see the balance between those two things? Is it seniority? Is it experience? Is it dependent on other factors?
I don't have a clear, concise answer, right? Because the truth of the matter is, what happens is, like you were saying, and we've been talking about that, generally the folks who get along well in the product ops space are people who get shit done, right? We're good at generally, okay, something needs to be solved, something needs to be done. People have been talking about it for 6 months. Product ops gets involved, the things move forward, right? We help move things forward. We help them just happen. And the truth of the matter is, it's so much easier to measure, even if it's that horrible not admin work, right? But that tactical work is so easy to measure because you can turn around and I said, I did X and it had X a result, right? When we're too strategic, it becomes a situation where you're in the meeting with the leadership, you're part of their conversations, you're helping shape that organization, right? But how the hell do you show the metrics to support that, right? How do you say, I bring value to that conversation? I helped shape how that organization functions. Because the people who are taking the credit for that will be the product leaders, the engineering leaders, the other leaders in the organization. Because we're their sounding board, we're their rubber duck, if you want to call it in some cases, right? In some cases, we're even influencing them because we're going in and we're saying, I'm seeing a bad behavior, and we kind of influence their thinking around it. So they adopt a better way of working around some things, right? But that's not measurable. So I think, again, what I try and do is I try and find, number one, the balance. And then one of the things I tell my team is, and people ask, oh, where is the scope of product operations? And it's like, I say, there's clear things that are our scope, right? And there are clear things that aren't our scope. but there are tons of things that are gray area. And what I mean by this is, and that's why we do quarterly planning, right? Which is we focus on what does the company need? What is important at that, right? And even throughout a quarter, right? So for example, and I remember there was a couple of years back, I was thinking about this and I had like a roadmap, things I was going to be building and everything. And then I heard in the meeting, we're going to be hiring X amount of people, right? And it was a big hiring process potentially. And you look and you think, okay, I could be doing all these other things, but suddenly I realized that what's important for this organization is they're going to have to be number one, going through, I don't know how many interview processes. They're going to have to be bringing and onboarding all these different people right across the organization. And they're going to have to do it really well so that people get integrated soon and really quickly, right? So that whole funnel of the initial funnel of someone has to be better. And so for me, I go to the product lead and I'll say, okay, I heard this. I think we should be talking to HR, to, the hiring team, to this, and we should work with them in just optimizing this whole process because we're going to need it. It's important right now. It's going to have high impact, right? Is it measurable? Unfortunately, not always. And so it's about finding that balance, right? It's about trying to find those things and yeah, I don't have a concrete answer, right? We have to keep jumping between the two a bit. I do try and avoid. So for me, one of the things I try and focus on is who are my main stakeholders? They have to understand the value. And people will turn around and say, oh, our stakeholders are the designers, the product managers, of this and that. And I'll turn around and I'll say, no, they really aren't. Right? Because everything we do will filter down into them. Occasionally, we will work with them on specific things and jump in there. But if I'm going too much into the tactical, what'll happen is I'll become one of those folks who's maybe a delivery manager within a team, right? Or product owner, and I'm doing stuff just for this pack of this. We're losing track of the bigger picture, right? And you're putting band-aid solutions to things. So I say, focus on those main stakeholders. They have to see the value you bring. If they don't see the value, that's where you're failing. Um, and
Yeah, it's
they're the
it's
ones that make
in,
decisions as well. Sorry, go ahead.
no, absolutely fine. I, s- I, s- I do quite a lot of like one-on-one coaching with people, usually in their uh, let's call it like a less experienced stage, moving up into like, maybe they've got like 5, 6 years working in a certain function, and the reason they're speaking with me and I'm coaching them is they want to grow into a leadership position eventually. And they always say, I want to be more strategic. And I always respond with, what does strategy mean? What do you mean when you use that word? And what are you not seeing, or what are you seeing in your role today that is or is not what you think that word means? I mean, essentially, strategy is just a plan which is designed to achieve goals, right? And you always have to have tactical work that is based on the strategy that you have. So when I'm thinking about product operations, and when there's this discussion between the strategical work and the tactical work, well, you need both. But what I think I'm hearing is we shouldn't be focusing so much on the tactical work because there is no strategy. That's what it sounds like. So tactical work is not an issue whatsoever. You have to have it to achieve your goals, meaning achieving your strategy. But when people say we shouldn't be doing too much tactical work, what I think they mean is there is nothing tying this to the strategy. There's no strategic alignment within the function itself, but also then within the organization and the wider business.
I love that. And actually it got me thinking because if you think about product operations work, if you want to think about it more strategically, right? The thing is, if we're going in the tactical, like I was saying, we're doing these simple band-aid solutions that work for that team or for this small group or for this small specific thing. Being more strategic is where you have these big things that you can change at the top level that have a ripple effect that have a much higher impact, right? Like if you help people understand this is the framework that leadership is using for prioritization, right? And now you can use the same framework for you, how you're prioritizing, or at least doing your business casing, whatever that you want to call it, right? That impact is huge. Whereas if you go into one pack and you say, oh, let's just figure out how you're doing your business casing and everything, it can be great if you can then scale it out. But you're then fighting an uphill battle, right? Because you have to convince other people it's worthwhile. Whereas at that strategic level, it's
Mm.
sometimes easier to go. I'm not saying it only works that way, but Just thinking out loud, right? Thinking out loud.
Yeah, that's interesting because to me that sounds like tactical work. Like let's use a again very basic example like you just used, which is here's a prioritization framework that a team can use to prioritize, maybe their monthly planning. And they could maybe even use it for sprint planning. Great. That's very like in the detail, team level tactical work. And if you could somehow broaden, as we used to say, amplify that goodness across the organization by impacting multiple teams. They all use the same framework. Fantastic. Still tactical, but sort of a broader, like middle range level impact. And if you could then convince leadership, I always say this in my talks, like convincing leadership, it's like the golden words, like how do you even do that? But if you can, collaborate with leadership enough that they realize that actually the framework that their teams are using is actually a really good strategic prioritization framework, and it can be used at the highest level of the organization. That's really good, but it's still tactical work. It's just having a high level of impact and therefore probably like broader as well.
But that's where I think that relationship with that leadership level and understanding the value you bring is super important, because if you've built up that relationship and you've built up that confidence from them, it's easier for me to go in there and say, I just saw this in this team and it was gold. And they'll say, oh, I want to listen. Versus I go in there and I say, I just saw this was gold. Okay, great, Hugo. We'll talk to you another day, right?
That's like strategic level influence. It's not
Exactly.
strategical work, it's strategic level influence. So therefore, to have that, I mean, I'm just speaking out loud now, which is what this podcast is about, right? To have that level of influence, you must have shown your capability at a strategic level, therefore, meaning that you're able to create a good, let's bring it back to product operations, you're able to produce a good product operations strategy that is proven and has been proven at other companies and historically at this organization to be you've achieved that strategy through the tactical work you've done, therefore proving that you can influence at that level.
And you basically touch on a point, which is to an extent, all product operations work is tactical, maybe, but the focus of where that tactical work is can go from more the strategic space to the more, team level. Let's not even call it tactical, right? It's like the individual or the IC level almost, right? It depends on where you can influence. And I think where you're focused will have, different levels of impact. So one is if you start at the bottom and you want to go up, you will have to then, like I said, you'll have to try and get the influence. You'll have to spotlight the good, but you have to get people to pay attention to the good that you're spotlighting, right? If you start at the other level, it becomes to an extent easier, but and this is an interesting point. We could have a whole conversation around this, right? Around accountability, ownership, and this kind of stuff. And it goes to what Marty Kagan has mentioned once or twice about we're covering for product leaders, right? Or the lack of quality of product leaders. It's the truth of the matter is if it gets to the point where the product leaders are unable to take what we work on together, right? And they then translate into their teams and they make it work and own it and help in amplifying it, it also fails.
Yeah, I mean, look, all product development work, and when I say product development, I include all the design, the product marketing, everything that goes into it, the engineering, the QA, all of it is tactical level work. If there is no strategy, those teams end up in the delivery death spiral, escaping the build trap, as Melissa's book is titled. Like you end up in that position, right, when when you don't have clear strategic alignment. It's the same with product operations. If there is no clear strategic alignment that the top level of the organization is bought into, just like they must be bought into the design strategy as well as the product strategy, all the tactical level work being, I've understood the strategy and the goals, I've decided to do something that fits within that, and I think that will make the difference and achieve that goal. That's all tactical level work is. Without that strategic framework and alignment, the tactical work will just be ongoing and it will be very much delivery focused. And I have seen this happen where the person that hires the product operations function and the people within it is maybe a bit too directive with, okay, here's the first 10 things you need to do. Now, if you start in that manner, you end in that manner, you will only do the things that that person asks you to do. And you'll always be seeking clarification and confirmation from that one person. And that's when you end up in that like tactical death spiral, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. Totally agree. Couldn't agree with you more. I think we're done
Cool.
for this one.
So we're done for today. We kept mostly on topic, I think. So again, as always, thanks everyone for listening. Please do go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. That's at thoughtsunruffled.substack.com, and keep an eye out for the next episode, which will be coming soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, folks.